The Eldar, or Aeldari, are one of the most ancient races in Warhammer 40k, outstripped mostly only by the Necrons. The fall of the Eldar caused the birth of the Chaos god Slaanesh, and began the Age of Strife. But was it preventable? Could the Eldar have averted the calamity that was to come, or was this something that they were just destined to do? Today we have myself, John, Danny, Adam, and Tom. Danny, let's start with you.
All right, so I think it's actually pretty clear that the fall could have been avoided because the fall did not destroy all the Eldar, right? There were the craft worlds that escaped. There were the Exodite worlds of people who had already kind of seen the writing on the wall that they needed to get out because there was the critical mass. The society was corrupting under the influence of just this kind of constant hedonism and, this kind of pursuit, this maniacal pursuit of, pleasure and of experience. And so I think if that movement, because the way it's always described in the lore is that these were splinter groups, right? These were fanatics. These were essentially survivalists. So it was a small sample of the population, but had the population, for whatever reason, somehow embraced this aesthetic, right? Had embraced asceticism, right? That it wouldn't have happened. It's clear that the Eldar could resist it, right? They're capable of it, of not falling into these impulses. It's just the cultural movement that needed to happen didn't take off, right? Like just again, the large body of the society, just didn't go with it. So I think it is not inevitable that this would have happened if the Eldar, especially early in the, Empire's rise, had dedicated to aestheticism the way the old ones had kind of warned them, right? Of like, you're a little too psychic, you're a little too emotional, you need to cultivate a proper spirit to balance out what's there, because the Eldar know about the warp. That's why they have the webway. Right. Like, they know about the warp, they know about the dangers, and they just didn't kind of heed the warnings that they were given. And then when people in their society started warning them of the path they were taking, they ostracized them rather than listen. So, but had that not happened, if there was, say a big push, maybe if the Eldar gods actually got more involved, right? And we're like, hey, no, do this thing. Besides like Segarok, it could have been avoided because for some Eldar populations, it was avoided, right? People did survive it. Not every Eldar succumbed to the kind of cult of pleasure that eventually birthed Slaanesh, right? Unfortunately, just most of the society did, but there were certainly, I think it's pretty clear that some were capable. And you see 10,000 years later with the craft worlds are surviving. I mean, in a sense, they are a dying race, but, they're not succumbing to the same thing, right? They're not, 10,000 years is a long time. If they were going to fall into bad habits, they would have fallen into bad habits by now, right? They would have been the Dark Eldar. So the fact that the craft worlds are still going, the Exodite worlds are still going in this kind of aestheticism mentality shows that it's not inherent to the Eldar that this would have happened. It's just what did happen, unfortunately.
Those are pretty good points, Danny. All right, Tom, how about you?
See, the thing that I'm focusing on is that, there are groups, like Danny said, that did escape it, that through their asceticism and their devotion to kind of a more pure way of living, did escape it. But I think that we can't look at a group of survivors and say that they're the exception to prove a rule, or they're the element to prove that the entire thing could have been saved, right? I mean, if we look at other empires, in the early pre Age of Enlightenment of Terra, there were multiple instances of kingdoms described as reaching these heights and then succumbing to pride or hedonism and then falling to make way for the next empire, the next rise. And the fall of the Eldar is often talked about as their fall is, a good reason why the Imperium of man was able to actually rise up, and take its seat as the next in ascendancy. I think it's one of those things where if we look at the actual nature of what the Eldar are, they're a psychic race. So as opposed to humanity, all of them have a level of psychic inclination or thinking. And additionally, you have them as an hyper-intelligent race. The dumbest, for lack of a better phrase, the most unintelligent Eldar is still significantly more intelligent than the most intelligent human, almost, pound for pound. And as a result of that, it's not just of their intelligence, so they can see this reason and this logic. It's also because of the nature of their souls. They're able to feel things so much more intensely. The Primarchs are often talked about as these demigods and these inhuman beings, but more often than not, there's subtext or subquotes or kind of thinking that Primarchs are in a way the most human out of any of the transhumans in the Imperium, because they feel things so intensely. And that intensity, I think, if it's, it's been shown through all of these hyper-intelligent beings to still pervade and to still conquer. Right, still being conquerors, and these hyper-intelligent beings still fell prey to their emotion. They fell, were consumed by it, by jealousies, fears, and desires, despite their hyper-intelligence. And I think asceticism is a way to conquer that and to curb it, but there's still this kind of lingering emotive, behavior that still kind of pervades. In all of the Imperium's interactions with the Eldar, they're always described as haughty and condescending, something that you don't often view with an ascetic lifestyle. And so even those Eldar that have maintained a more virtuous path are still kind of subject to that moral flaw of seeing themselves as higher or highest, even as their entire race is dying. I think, and I think the key thing too is that the national or the race-wide level of just borderline intelligence, the great intelligence that they had, that should have been what prevented them, right? That should have been what prevented the fall and giving in to those intense desires and emotions. But because of their very nature, because of the way their souls existed in the warp, those desires were so intense, I don't think it could have been prevented. I think if anything, at best, it would have been delayed.
Those were also some really interesting points, Tom. Adam, how about you? What do you think?
I agree with Tom. I don't think it's something that could have been prevented at all. Like he said, the psychic echo of the Eldar is much greater than humans. They as been described by a few people, a human is, their soul is like a spark in the darkness. And, humans that achieve a lot are great humans, like a Primarch or Lord Solo Marcarius or any high level psychers. They're like a bright star in the Imperium. Eldar is like a whole race of that. Their stars shine brighter, so they become more focused with the chaos powers. In addition, they're more empathetic to each other as well as the universe around them. So any feelings they have are more amplified. And I think like Tom was saying, as empires rise and fall, part of that fall is usually some sort of decadence. Maybe not as intense as like an Eldar. But people mention the blood sports of the Romes, and even today, some people compare some of the sporting events that America has spawned as more like the modern blood sports when compared to the Roman Empire. And so I think that would have happened regardless, like Tom said, regardless of when it happened, mainly because after the war in heaven, and once their power had grown because of that, the Eldar really had nothing else to do, so to speak. They can keep the orcs in check. They can keep these other races in check. Not that big of a deal, but okay, so what are we going to do today? What are we going to do tonight? I guess let's just mess around. Let's see, what does this do? What does this do? Oh, this feels good. Maybe I should do it some more. It's almost like that first hit is free. And once they get a taste of it, it's eventually going to take them down that path. And like Tom said, I personally think that they could delay it, but I don't think they could just stop it altogether. The development of the aspect warriors and that way of life, moving to the exilite worlds, didn't really come to them until everything happened to go downhill. So I don't even think they would have even thought to do any preventative stuff because they didn't really see the need, much like people do today when you go to the doctor when something's wrong. A lot of people don't go to their checkups and stuff. So until something's wrong, and then they go, and then they find out something's wrong. So I think it's that same nature in regards to the Eldar as to why I feel that the fall was inevitable, and it was probably helped by Slaanesh. As Slaanesh started to grow and gain more influence, it started to affect them more. And yeah, they have the Dark Eldar have Kamara, and that's how they kind of get away from her. But some of what they do is still a reflection of She Who Thirsts. And so even now, there's part of the society that may have gotten away from her. But I don't think they're not totally free of the influence of Slaanesh, which is why they still do the blood games and blood sports and the slaves and the slave raids and all that other stuff. So I don't think there was a way for them to get out of it. Maybe, like Tom said, maybe delay it, but it's hard for me to see a way for them to stop it because the solutions they found was after the problem was already way past them being able to fix it.
So, I mean, I think what's important here is that, like, we look at that the Eldar are really kind of the approximation of Voltaire's quote about, that history is full of the sound of silken slippers going down the stairs and wooden clogs coming up, right? And that's really kind of, this idea that they reached this pinnacle and then kind of fell apart the same way the humans did, right, in the dark age of technology, right, that they ascended and then collapsed as well. So you could say that maybe the fall is inevitable, in the sense of all great empires fall, right? Like that there's just that maybe it's not necessarily a human folly, but a sentient folly, because even the old ones fall, right? That, just at a certain point, no matter how powerful you are, that power blinds you to what you need to do, right, in the situation, rather than, because you're so used to being in control, you're so used to basically being in charge, you stop thinking about how to maintain that. And, the threats start kind of coming from within and crumbling, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think, again, the Eldar have survived for 10,000 years after the fall in the craft worlds and the Exodite worlds. And, I'm trying to think of any, and maybe there is, and I just don't remember it or I didn't read it, of lore about a craft world or an Exodite world kind of choosing to fall to Slaanesh, right? Like kind of repeating the same mistakes. I mean, craft worlds definitely have died, right? They've been destroyed by demonic incursions or even the Imperium or Tyranids or whatever, right? They definitely have gone down, same with Exodite worlds, but I don't recall reading one that kind of willingly kind of fell back into the pattern. So I think the craft world and the Harlequins show that that the Eldar can resist Slaanesh for essentially indefinitely if they have the kind of correct structures in place, right? Like the craft worlds have the aspect warrior system, right, and that kind of sheer aestheticism, and the Harlequins have Segorok and their kind of very very specific way of life. So I think that it's not that the Eldar were always going to fall to Slaanesh. In that sense, I think it's just all empires fall. It's just because they're such a psychic race, and that the warp is fueled by by psychic sentience. That it was just, unfortunately, that was probably what was going to happen. Is oops, you're going to birth a god. I mean, if they had gone hardcore, kind of instead of pursuing cultural experiences and physical experiences, and if they had just gone full hardcore into war, we're going to master war, we're going to dedicate our society to Cain, they probably just would have made Khorne stronger, right?
That's a good point. I think that's another thing to think about is this interesting dichotomy we've seen to have drawn between small localities versus an empire. And I'm wondering if it's actually the scale of which that makes it impossible or inevitable or not. Like if you have a small group of people who, despite their empathy, despite their soul fire, as it were, are able to maintain this, power to them, they're able to do it. But maybe it's a question of being surrounded by so much of that, or so much more of what it is their race can be, that may have led to that. And I think that's also pretty, a good point too about war that both you and Adam have brought up, which is that it was this lack of focus to something else. Granted, war could have made Khorne stronger, or Bert the Second Blood God, I don't know, but it was, this lack of focus and this ambling in this direction. They kind of had reached the pinnacle, and I think that maybe the key thing is, like, you can say maybe an Exodite world reaches the best that it could be, but it's just a world. It's just a small spot in an otherwise massive universe, and maybe that is what they're able to do to allow themselves to survive and to still prosper. Maybe they should never have been an empire, and that would have actually prevented their fall.
So I think in a couple of ways, the downfall being inevitable is like a part of like just the historical arc of things. I think kind of like what Danny was saying, but also I think at some point the boredom sets in, which I think was one of Adam's points of, well, we're the biggest, baddest thing on the block. There's literally nobody to rival us. And so because of that, well, what else are we going to do with our lives? And from my understanding, the Eldar are actually at their height worse than the Dark Eldar are. Like, they are super sadistic. They have like killers roaming the streets looking to just kill to get their next fix in that. They had, entire worlds screaming and chanting for the blood sport. And so in many ways, I think that they were feeding so much into all the Chaos Gods that there was just too much and it spilled over, And but was that inevitable? I don't know. I mean, could they clearly had the ability to mitigate all of this and take a different path, but it's very rare for any society, historically speaking, for like humans, to collectively choose a new path and like go down it once they're well down another path. So like, especially if that path that you were on led you to, historic heights and great power and, the ability to become gluttonous, heathenistic, terrible people who can indulge every single thing they can possibly think of. How do you collectively choose to change at that point? I mean, there's not a whole lot of collective societal choices that have been made ever in our like actual human history. And since, a lot of our fantasy and science fiction is based on our actual history, I think that part of the problem is you can't collectively make that decision. And then anybody who does speak up is ostracized. They're thrown out. I think it's also important to note that like the craft worlds were an infinitesimally small number of the Eldar. Even though they're like, giant world ships, they're still a tiny number. You think about it, the birth of Slaanesh created the Eye of Terror out of the home worlds of the Eldar Empire. And the Eye of Terror is gigantic. And like every one of those worlds became a home for like great demon princes, right? So like you're talking about a massive number of worlds and empires that was just like the core of the empire. And the craft worlds are tiny in comparison. It'd be like saying in, 3,000 years from now that, well, the U.S. would have made it another 300 or 400 years after the year 2000 if they just listened to the Amish, right? Like, that's a hard case to make, in my opinion. Could it be true? Well, I don't know, sure. The Amish lifestyle seems awfully simplistic to me and easy compared to, like, having to be in an interconnected world and all this stuff. But, like, can you definitively state that that's, going to be the way to do it or better? I don't know. Or that it was even possible for a society to, like, go down an entirely new path? I don't know.
Well, I think that a better example in regards to what you're saying, John, compared to modern times, let's say, is probably a U.S. aircraft carrier. Since it's more or less a floating city, that would be more apt if to say, like, the people on this, that let's say something's happening in the U.S. and the ship is not allowed to come back to the land for whatever reasons, or San Diego's, let's say, to the ports. So it'd be easier to say that that's probably more in comparison to what the Eldar did. And then something happens to the United States, and the last vestiges of the United States culture is on these floating aircraft carriers that are just floating between island to island, resupplying. In addition, I think when Danny mentioned that the human collapse from the Age of Strife, the only difference between that and a normal civilization collapse is the fact that the Age of Strife was actually a direct result of the birth of Slaanesh.
So are you saying that it's more akin to Waterworld than anything else?
And you might go juice.
It's an underrated film. That's all I'm going to say. Highly underrated.
It is. Not to diverge, but yeah, it is underrated.
Okay, it's not, because I actually saw it in the theaters. But the show at Universal Studios Hollywood is much better than the movie. I'm not saying that because I actually worked on it. But yes, I think more or less that the that's probably a better example of what the Eldar went through in regards to like having these ships out, because the craft worlds were actually originally trader ships. They weren't like built specifically to house their civilization. They were built to house the families and basically like the rogue traders, because the trip would take so long because they don't use the warp like the humans did. And like I said, you know, since there wasn't a centralized civilization for the humans at that time, because it was more spread out because of the faster than light travel, there was no centralized government like the Imperium. So when the birth of Slaanesh happened, it caused a bit more disruption, but it didn't cause the decline of an empire. Maybe the decline of maybe knowledge and civilization in general, yes. But I still think that, like we talked about, the boredom of the Eldar proved to be their downfall.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Pod Save the Imperium, all about the fall of the Aeldari and if it could be avoided or not. Hopefully you learned something along the way and enjoyed the conversation. Make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast on your podcast consuming app of choice. We are now on iTunes. You can also follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. It is a Pod Save the Imperium on both those apps. Have a nice day.